New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to look at hieroglyphic thinking. With me is Normandi Ellis, who is author of many books based on ancient Egyptian texts, including her translation of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Its title is Awakening Osiris. She is co-author with Nicki Scully of The Union of Isis and Thoth, Magic and Initiatory Practice in Ancient Egypt. She is also author of Imagining the World into Existence and Invoking the Scribes of Ancient Egypt. Welcome, Normandi.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. And now we're going to dig into a particular talent that you have developed, a rare talent, but an important talent, reading hieroglyphs. And it's not just like learning how to decode a language. It's about a whole mindset.
That's exactly right. And I think that it was for me, it became a 10-year practice of falling in love with hieroglyphs. When I was much younger, I couldn't decide whether I was going to be a painter or a writer. And so when it came time to translate a language, I simply gravitated to a language that was both. And in fact, there's no difference in the ancient Egyptian language between a writer and an artist. It's the exact same word. We have the scribe's palette, and we have the reed pen, and we had the rolled up scroll tied with string, and that was the essential tool of either the artist or the scribe. So it became kind of natural that I would gravitate to that. When in graduate school, they asked me if I had another language besides Spanish, and my answer was no. So the teacher, I'm translating a Spanish text, he says, go to your next language. What would you like to study? I said, hieroglyphs, because I happen to have had this book given to me. So since I didn't know them to start out with, I took it upon myself to just use my curiosity to follow the trail that this was leading me down. And he said, just get various translations by other people, get a good grammar book. I got Alan Gardner's Egyptian Grammar, get a couple of other variant dictionaries, and just open them up and play with them. I got myself a copybook. I began to copy every text that I could find to copy the hieroglyphs. And I really think that that's one of the things that I learned was important, is that for me, and maybe it's for everyone this way, language came through my hand. It was a learning process of something that when I copied the glyphs, I could feel their impression, the way the pen bit into the paper. And so I felt that I was getting it like in a more physical sense, which was great for me because learning hieroglyphs is a very physical language. Okay. And, it's about the nature of things, you know, in fact, you know, the word for alchemy, Egypt was called the land of Chem. Okay, so from which we get chemistry, the black land.
Alchemy, yes.
Alchemy, right. And alchemy means basically, literally translated, that Egyptian thingy. So it was really hieroglyphic thinking was a process of learning alchemy, that Egyptian thingy.
Well, and what you mean by alchemy here is not the chemistry part of it, I don't think, but it's a magical practice.
It's a magical practice.
Ancient Egypt, above all, as I read what little I've read about it and of it are the magical practices.
That's right. And so when I talk about in imagining the world into existence, I talk about the various number of ways in which the world comes into existence. You know, the god Khnum makes people out of mud, you know, on his little potter's wheel. Mm-hmm. And there's the goddess Neith, who reaches into herself, which is the great green waters and the net of being, and withdraws these creatures from herself. Mm-hmm. And two of the most important ways of creation, Ptah opens his mouth, you know, and when he opens his mouth, you see this hieroglyph for the mouth, and then you see water ripples. And so it's the word above the water. Mm. And it goes all the way back to the story in Genesis of the vibration of language and consciousness to create something. Mm-hmm. And that's the quintessential Egyptian thingy, is language and consciousness creating something.
Well, the Egyptian language, the ancient Egyptian language as expressed in hieroglyphs, first of all, it wasn't really decoded, was it, until the Rosetta Stone was found. It was completely mysterious to Westerners for quite a long time.
Yes, it was. It was. And Thomas Young and Francois Champollion were sort of dueling it out to figure out who was going to translate them first. And I love the story of Champollion. When they found the Rosetta Stone, he was 9 years old. And when he finally translated the piece, he was 35. You know, so I don't feel so bad that it took me 10 years to do Awakening Osiris.
Well, here's the mystery to me, because if I understand you get a feeling from the pictures intuitively of what they mean. Of course, you've studied it intellectually, academically, but it's a very intuitive process. Yet until the Rosetta Stone was found, intuitive efforts to translate were, well, I guess there was no way to validate them.
This is correct. And I think one of the things that we had as a mistaken idea about translating a language, especially when we're working in a Roman alphabet, we think that it's an abstraction and that this abstraction means something. And so when we look at a pictograph or hieroglyph in this case, we think that the hieroglyph that we're looking at is the thing itself. One of the things we're not taking into consideration is that it's a symbol and that there are associations that go along with this image. There are sounds that go along with this image. And so it's not just the picture, the sounds, you know, and truly it was really nouns and verbs. That was really ancient Egyptian language. It was like this thing, this happened, nouns and verbs. So when I started to study hieroglyphs, I was looking at, okay, here's a word. I've written it out, and I'll just say it's the word heka, because that's an interesting word for me to work with. Okay, so, and it has this 3 sort of like loops of thread, okay? And then it has this pair of arms that's like reaching up, you know, expressing, you know, devotion, if you will. And then it has that scribe's palette with a rolled up scroll tied with string and 3 little seeds beside that. That's the whole word for heka.
That's a complex image. And if I recall from your writing, heka is a word that refers to magic.
It refers to magic. That's right. And so the ha is the sound, and the ka, which is a double sound, it's a bilateral. Okay, it's the image of the ka, heka, and then this thing at the end of it is called the determinative. And it tells you the quality of the thing itself. Now, if you just say heka, you know, oh, that's magic, but the way in which heka is used becomes a little different, because you'll have that same image with a T at the end of it. Right? And that's Heket. And then you'll have a little frog. And that's the frog goddess of transformation.
I see.
Which is a magical process. Right? And later moves into the Greek as the goddess Hecate. Okay? So there's that whole double toil and trouble idea.
The goddess of witchcraft.
That's right. That's right. As a negative concept of making magic. Though this is just an intuition. I'm not going to say that I followed this exactly, but I believe there are many words in Sanskrit, like ta netter, which we spoke about earlier, as tantra.
Yes.
And heka, moving into another possible idea that it means beautiful sentence or beautiful utterance as a haiku.
Oh.
So heka, and Egyptian language itself, is more closely related to poetry and our concepts of poetry than anything else that I know of. And when I came to begin to translate the hieroglyphs, I came at it as a writer, you know,
and a poet.
And a poet, exactly right. And so that's what intrigued me about it, was that I could take this one word and find it moving into all these different ways. There were no spaces between the words. And so a word would run into another word, like ta netter, to become tantra. Okay, and so you could interpret it a number of different ways if you took the space out. You can read hieroglyphs right to left or left to right. And so there are some times it can move backwards and create meaning. There's a lot of punning and repetition in the way that poetic sound repeats and works on sound alikes, if you will, you know, phrases that are alliterative or something like that. And so the hieroglyphs were doing that as well.
Now, I, years ago, had the privilege of interviewing Leonard Shlain, the author of The Alphabet and the Goddess.
Right.
And his thesis is fascinating because he says that the problem of patriarchy and the suppression of women is associated with the alphabetical languages, the development really of Hebrew and Arabic and the Bible. And at that time is when we saw the suppression of women, whereas in the ancient Egyptian culture, men and women were much more equal. In fact, the succession of pharaohs, as I recall, was through the female lineage.
That's right. And truly, it was much more equal in the Old Kingdom than it became in the New Kingdom. So it started out more equal. And I think as it went on and began to come to a conclusion with Ramses, you know, where the little woman comes up to his ankle.
Oh, yeah.
You know, at Abu Simbel. But initially, women were equally high priests.
Yes.
They were sharing the royal position with their pharaohs. They were doctors. They were, you know, you have a lot of women who worked in the medical profession and were scribes.
Yeah. Well, Leonard Shlain believes that it's because of the hieroglyphic language of the ancient Egyptians that they use both sides of their brain equally. And when we developed the alphabetical languages, which he sees as more linear rather than pictorial, that we began suppressing that part of our mind, and that the appreciation of the female has a lot to do with the appreciation of graphic images.
I think that's true. And I think that the first hieroglyphs that we know of, which are granted not exactly hieroglyphs, but more pictographic, are on pots that women have created and have placed in the fire. You know, they're more the sacred vessel, and they saw themselves as the sacred vessel, and men saw them as sacred vessels, you know. And I think that the development of the hieroglyphic language began there, primarily because women were staying in one spot, having children. They became the crossroads of the culture, if you will. And the male energy was out, moving around, following the game, you know, and would bring it back. So I think that has a lot to do with how language developed at one particular spot, let's say, and stayed there.
Well, Leonard Shlain in his argument says that, for example, amongst the cultures in which the female is the most repressed would be in the Muslim world. And there, the depiction of graphic images of any sort are forbidden.
That's right. That's right. Right. Because the it's interesting that the mental process becomes the process that takes precedent, and not the matter or mother process, which is connected to what my friend, the poet Robert Kelly, calls thingliness. Okay. And so the ancient Egyptian writing was a language of thingliness.
It would seem to me to be well grounded. That's my sense of the feminine energy is connected, for me at least, to the earth. And I do think you get, as culture shifted, the ancient cultures all worship goddesses, but including especially the most ancient cultures that had the great fertility goddesses everywhere. And then, according to Shlain, and I think he makes a good point, we had the sky god.
Right.
And the sky god is associated with the alphabetical written linear languages. It's sort of a disconnection from the earth itself.
Yes, I think that's true. And I think one of the things that's interesting to me is there was a very ancient festival. This was related to a different god, a sky god, the god Amun. And he was one of those all by himself, in the world. Yeah. And he had this longing for an other. And so he created, the beloved, the other. It's a version of Isis. It's all vowel sounds. It's like I-U-A-U-U-S-E-T. It's all vowel sounds. But it's a version of the name of Isis. But it means the hand of God. And in this case, the God is making love with him, herself. It's all one. Yes. It's one being. And then it separates. And then that becomes one of the stories where it starts with the connection between the two modes of thinking, modes of being, etc.
Let me ask you this, since you've been translating hieroglyphs and studying hieroglyphs now for decades, how has it changed you?
Ooh, well, what a good question. I believe that it has made me more open to seeing the natural world as the divine world, because that's the first thing that you have to pay attention to when you're doing the hieroglyphs. You have to pay attention to the spirit of the glyph that you're translating and its spiritual signature, if you will. And so when I'm looking at a hieroglyph for a tree, for example, and I notice the branching of the leaves and so on, I'm seeing, okay, that's the spirit nature that, goes into bifurcation, that becomes the lineage of the ladder, in essence, which we talked about earlier. It's like all of that whole linear thought disappears, and it's just the symbol at that point. It's just the connection that my eye makes and my heart makes. And I sort of like bypass the mind in a bit, but the sound, you can't translate hieroglyphs without translating it by sound as well. If I have a dung beetle, for example, and we'll say, oh, everybody knows what a scarab is. They put them on their heart, with the dead people. But it meant to become, it meant to create, it meant to be something, it meant to initiate something, to begin. And so you see this translation that, I'll just say it, Nukpuim Kefera, Kefere, Keferu, Nukpuim Rea, and you have all these dung beetles repeated, Kefer. And it translates as several meanings of that one beetle. In the beginning, I became the becoming, being what I created. And so it's like all of that,
It seems as if you used the metaphor of the ladder earlier, and in our previous interview, we talked about the ladder as relating to the process of ascension and the process of connection to sacred realms. And it seems as if what you're telling me is that in this ancient language, every symbol evokes a different way of connecting with the sacred.
I think so. And when you see those really wonderful Sufi singers and dancers, and it's like the sound and the dance and the movement takes them into this spiral, and they're just, in this ecstatic experience. That's how hieroglyphs are for me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like, it's the dance of the sound, of the language, of the meaning. It's, you know, and I feel like I'm taking from this edge of the sky and that edge of the sky and this edge of the sky, and I'm weaving this whole thing as I keep going up higher and higher. And it's just, to other people, just a word. But to me, it's like the sound of God.
Mm-hmm. There's a potency.
There's a potency that comes into that. And when you start thinking hieroglyphically, you start seeing the whole world as an illuminated text. Everything that you look at becomes an illuminated text
Mm-hmm.
because it was made of thingliness, if that makes sense.
Well, it seems as if what this is suggesting to me is that what we're doing right now, we're recording a video, and it's the video itself is like a hieroglyph.
Exactly. And so turn the sound off, if you will, and you simply watch the gestures of the hands.
Mm-hmm.
And they do something that creates meaning.
Yeah.
And the faces and the expressions do something that creates meaning. And even the proximity of bodies to each other creates a meaning.
Yes.
And so I think the Egyptians saw all of that. Their architecture, for example, was just another form of hieroglyphic thinking.
Mm.
That it was the way they put the temples together were hieroglyphs. If you look at the images on the wall, you know, you're going to find spaces between the god and the pharaoh that if you kind of shift your eyes a little bit, the spaces themselves create hieroglyphs.
Mm-hmm.
And even the emptiness has a voice.
Mm-hmm. And another thing this has done for you, as I understand it, especially from our previous interview, is opened up a kind of shamanic vision where you find yourself really communicating with the Neteru, the ancient gods, deities, devas, if you will, of Egypt. They become living forces.
Yes, for me, they are living forces. I believe they're living forces for everyone who has eyes and ears to see and hear them.
Mm-hmm.
I found initially that it took a lot of releasing my idea of what I thought something meant.
Yeah.
You know, so when I'm learning to translate hieroglyphs, let's say, back in, you know, the early 80s, all right, I've got all these books of mythology and grammar and history and, you know, trips down the Nile and what people saw. And I'm reading Florence Nightingale in Egypt. And, you know, I'm just like gathering all this information until I'm so overwhelmed that I just fall asleep on top of my books. And then my husband would come in the door and the door would slam and I'd wake up and say, oh, now I know what that means. It was like I had to have that time inside the psyche to just do the whirl that I talked about.
Hypnagogic state of consciousness.
Exactly. And then that really informed how I could translate and write, you know, a paragraph for something that really looked only like a line of hieroglyphs. Because it was more than just what the gobbledygook of one word for another word.
What you're saying reminds me very much of Erich Fromm's classic book, The Forgotten Language.
Yes.
Of dream interpretation.
It is like dream interpretation. And that's a wonderful image because the eye itself is a huge Egyptian image.
Yes.
And there are a number of ways to look at an eye on a hieroglyphic text in a wall. If the eye appears to be slightly lidded, it means to dream, to imagine, if it's wide open, it means to become aware and awake of something, especially if it has little eyelashes around it. Other times it simply means to envision something, to see it as if it were full-blown happening. And a lot of that depends on the little sounds around it, you know, as part of it. Osiris, that's his hieroglyph. It's the eye above the throne. And so it's his ability to see on his throne in the darkness. That is a hypnagogic state that he's in almost constantly all the time. understanding his life in that way.
You know, it's interesting. The image of the eye, it's reminding me now everybody has a dollar bill. And if you look at the inverse of the Great Seal of the United States on the dollar bill, there's a pyramid with an eye at the top.
Right, there is. And the story behind that I've been told, now I don't know that this is true, but I believe that it's true, is that it's a Freemason symbol.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is. The all-seeing eye.
The all-seeing eye of the divine.
Mm-hmm.
I look at it hieroglyphically, and I hear, watch how you spend this money. So I guess what that means to me is that it is, on a spiritual level, what the Freemasons would have thought. It's also on a material level.
Yes.
Exactly what I was looking at, and because of where it's placed, it means a certain thing.
Yes.
That same eye above a pyramid in Egypt means something entirely different to me.
What would it mean there?
It's the power of transformation. Mm-hmm. It's the phoenix on its pyre. It's the awakened one who has,
Well, I get the feeling that some of the founding fathers of our country had the idea that the United States might represent that kind of an awakening. I know at the base of the pyramid is written the Latin phrase, Novus Ordo Seclorum, which I believe is translated to a new order of the ages.
That's right. That's right. And
but they're hearkening back to ancient Egypt.
They
clearly.
They are. Mm-hmm. And they're hearkening back again to the ages, the 2,160 years, that it takes for an age to shift and transform. And I think that that's really important too. But God sees it all. The divine sees it all in whichever way you define God.
Well, so hieroglyphic thinking is in many ways a way to connect with the divine.
It is a way to connect with the divine on a day-to-day basis.
Normandi Ellis, thank you once again for sharing this time with me. It went quickly.
It did. Thank you so much.
And it's a joy. Thank you.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy.